Chapter 3 In the Pasture.
Heidi was awakened the next morning by a shrill whistle. For a moment, she didn't know where she was. Sunshine was pouring in her window, so that the hay glistened like gold. Then she heard her grandfather's deep voice outside. In a moment, Heidi had jumped out of bed, pulled on her undershirt and petticoat, and run outside. Peter was there with his flock. Little Swan and Little Bear came tripping out of the shed in front of the grandfather.
"Would you like to go to the pasture too?"
he asked Heidi. Heidi clapped her hands and jumped for joy.
"You must wash first."
He pointed to a tub of water warming in the sun.
"Come inside, General of the Goats, and bring your knapsack with you."
Peter, surprised, obeyed the call and brought along the little bag which carried his meager lunch. Inside the hut, the old man cut large chunks of cheese and bread and dropped them into the boy's sack.
"Now the bowl."
He said as he tucked it in beside the bread.
"Milk 2 bowls full from Little Swan for Heidi at noon. And take care that she doesn't fall off the cliffs."
Yes, Uncle.
Peter could hardly take his eyes off Heidi's bread and cheese. They were twice as big as the tiny slivers he had for his lunch. Heidi was so delighted to be going up the mountain that she danced and skipped all the way. Bright sunshine picked out the blue and yellow of gentian and primroses in the meadows. Soon Heidi had an armful of buttercups. The pasture where Peter usually spent the day was at the foot of a rocky mountain peak. When they reached the highest point, Peter took off his knapsack and tucked it into a hollow where it would be safe from the strong mountain winds. Heidi wrapped her flowers in her apron and tucked it in beside the knapsack. Then she sat down beside Peter and looked all around. The valley lay far below. Before her stretched a wide field of snow. On the left, a gigantic outcropping of rock and bald, jagged cliffs rose sternly into the blue sky. Everywhere there was a deep stillness. Peter, who had been up before dawn gathering his herd from the villagers, lay down and closed his eyes. Heidi played quietly with the goats until Peter woke up from his nap and began setting out their meal. He spread a square of cloth on the grass. On one side, he put Heidi's large pieces of bread and cheese. On the other, his small ones. Then he called Little Swan and milked her.
Where do you get your milk?
She asked him.
From Snail, my goat.
Peter replied, pointing to a skinny little animal. Heidi drank 2 bowls of milk, then ate some bread. The cheese she handed to Peter.
You may have that.
She said.
I've had enough.
Peter stared at her in surprise. When he did not take the food from her hand, she lay it on his knee. Still puzzled, the goat herd bobbed his head in thanks, then ate the largest meal he'd ever had in his life. Peter was licking the last crumbs from his fingers when he suddenly turned his head and listened intently. Jumping up, he began to run.
What is it, Peter?
Heidi cried. She ran after him to the cliff's edge, where a little goat was leaping heedlessly. Peter flung himself down on the ground and just managed to seize one of its legs before it fell into the ravine to a certain death. The goat bleated in fear and struggled to free itself from Peter's grasp.
Help me, Heidi.
Peter cried. Heidi pulled a handful of sweet-smelling herbs from the earth and held them under the goat's nose.
Come, little goat, be good.
She coaxed.
You don't want to fall and break your bones, do you?
The goat stopped thrashing and turned to nibble on the herbs. Peter seized its collar and hoisted it back onto safe ground.
There!
He cried, and lifted his long stick to beat the little animal.
No, no!
Heidi protested. She grabbed his arm, her eyes flashing.
I won't let you.
He can go
Peter said slyly.
if you promise to give me some of your cheese again tomorrow.
Heidi readily agreed.
You can have it all, tomorrow and every day. But you must promise not to hit the goats. Not this one or anyone.
Peter shrugged.
It's all the same to me.
He said. He let go of the goat, and it bounded back to the flock. The day passed quickly. As the sun began to sink behind the great peak of the mountain, the snow reflected its light in a glory of rose and gold. Heidi let out a scream.
Peter, the mountain, it's on fire.
It is always so when evening comes.
Peter explained.
It's not really on fire.
But what is it? Look at the snow and those tall pointy rocks. What are they called?
Mountains don't have names.
He said.
Oh, look! The fire has gone out. Everything is gray.
Heidi sank sadly to the ground beside Peter, who was peeling the bark off a new staff.
It will be just the same tomorrow.
He said.
Get up. We must go home.
When they reached the hut, Heidi ran straight to her grandfather.
It was so beautiful.
She cried.
The fire on the mountain and the snow and the flowers. See what I've brought you.
She shook out her apron. But the flowers that tumbled to the ground were not the ones she had picked. Instead, they looked like wisps of hay.
What's happened?
Heidi cried.
Flowers like to stand out in the sunshine rather than be shut up in your apron.
The grandfather explained.
Then I will never pick them again. Grandfather, why don't the mountains have names? And why does the fire come at night?
Jump into the wash tub while I milk the goats,
The old man said.
and then I'll tell you.
Over their supper of milk and bread, her grandfather explained.
The mountains do have names. The one you were on is called Falcon's Nest. Did you like it there?
Oh, yes.
The child exclaimed.
Especially when the fire came. Why did that happen?
The grandfather stroked his beard thoughtfully.
You see, that is the sun's way of saying good night to the mountains. The sun sends them its most beautiful rays so that they may not forget it before the next morning.
This pleased Heidi, and she could hardly wait for another day to see the sun again. But first, she had to go to sleep. And that night, she dreamed of goats leaping up the steep slopes of a shining mountain. Questions. 1. What awakened Heidi from her sound sleep the next morning? 2. Why did Peter come so early? 3. Did Heidi like to go to the pasture? 4. Did Peter carry a rich lunch for himself? 5. Why did Peter tuck his knapsack into a hollow? 6. Why did Peter take a nap after they reached the pasture? 7. Did Peter often have the chance to eat cheese? 8. What happened after Peter had just eaten his lunch? 9. Was the mountain really on fire at sunset? 10. How did the old man explain to his granddaughter that the mountain was not on fire?